The snowstorm began as a whisper, an unassuming dusting of flakes tumbling gently from a steel-gray sky. By mid-afternoon, however, it had transformed into a relentless howl, the wind screaming like a trapped animal and thick curtains of snow obliterating the world outside. The storm cut off the small mountain lodge from civilization in less than an hour. Lena stared out the frosted window, her breath clouding the glass. "It's worse than they said," she murmured, her voice tight with unease. The lodge was supposed to be a weekend retreat, a reprieve from the grind of city life for her and her 3 friends. Now it felt more like a prison. Behind her, Jake fumbled with the old wood stove, his curses barely audible over the wind's ferocity. "This thing's useless," he muttered, slamming the iron door shut. "We should have just stayed home." "Well, we're here now," Chloe snapped, her nerves fraying. She sat cross-legged on the sofa, trying to warm her hands with a cup of lukewarm tea. Beside her, Ethan scrolled through his phone, his brow furrowed. "No service," Ethan announced grimly, tossing the phone onto the coffee table. "Even the Wi-Fi's out." Jake snorted. "No Wi-Fi? Now it's a real tragedy." Lena ignored him, her gaze fixed on the snowstorm. The wind had picked up, throwing snow against the windows in rapid, angry bursts. She thought she saw something move in the swirling white, a shadow, long and fleeting. But when she blinked, it was gone. "What if we lose power?" Chloe asked, her voice a fragile thread. "How long can we last with just the firewood?" "Don't borrow trouble," Jake said, though his bravado felt hollow. "Storm will blow over by morning." But as the hours dragged on, the storm only grew stronger. By nightfall, the temperature inside the lodge had dropped sharply, forcing the group to huddle together near the fire. The windows rattled in their frames, the wind screaming like something alive. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The shadow she'd seen earlier played on her mind, a nagging itch at the edge of reason. She kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see someone or something watching them from the storm. The first sign that something was wrong came when the door to the storage room slammed shut on its own. Jake laughed it off as a draft, but Lena noticed the way his eyes darted to the door again and again. An hour later, Ethan claimed he heard footsteps upstairs, though everyone knew they were the only ones in the lodge. "This place is old," Jake said, his voice unconvincing. "Probably just the wind or the house settling." "Or something else," Chloe whispered, clutching her knees to her chest. The power finally died just before midnight. The fire cast flickering shadows on the walls as the group sat in uneasy silence, the only sound the relentless howl of the wind. Then came the knock. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm. A soft, deliberate tap-tap-tap at the front door. "Did you hear that?" Lena whispered. "No," Jake said quickly, his voice too loud, too forceful. But then it came again, louder this time. "Tap-tap-tap," Chloe gasped, clinging to Ethan. "Someone's out there." "Impossible," Jake said, though his voice trembled. No one could survive out there. Lena stood, her pulse thundering in her ears. "What if they need help?" Jake grabbed her arm. "Don't. We can't just leave them out there." Before anyone could stop her, Lena crossed the room and unlatched the door. It swung open, revealing nothing but swirling snow and darkness. "Hello," she called, her voice swallowed by the wind. There was no response, only the eerie stillness of the storm. She closed the door, her fingers shaking. "That was stupid," Jake snapped. "Now we're letting the cold in." But Lena barely heard him. Her eyes were drawn to the floor near the door. There, in the thin layer of snow that had blown in, was a single footprint. It was impossibly large, the shape distorted, almost animal-like. "What made that?" Chloe whispered, her face pale. The knock came again, this time from the back door.
Tap, tap.
Ethan swore under his breath. "There's no back door to this lodge." Lena's blood ran cold. They all knew it was true. The lodge had only one entrance. The fire sputtered, the shadows on the walls deepening. The knock came again, closer now. Tap, tap, tap. And then they heard it, a low guttural growl followed by the creak of floorboards upstairs. Whatever it wasn't outside anymore. "Stay together," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible over Chloe's quiet sobs. The footsteps above them grew louder, heavier, until they seemed to shake the very walls. Then they stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. The door to the storage room creaked open. The fire went out.
Story number 2.
The snowstorm raged like a living thing, clawing at the walls of the old cabin with icy fingers. The group of 6 had planned this as a winter getaway, a chance to escape the chaos of the city and unplug for a few days. But as the wind howled and the snow piled higher, it became clear they were trapped. The nearest town was miles away, and the roads were buried. Worse, the storm showed no signs of letting up. It was sometime after midnight when Danny first heard the noise. He had been lying awake on the lumpy sofa in the main room, staring at the ceiling and listening to the storm. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him. But then it came again, a long, low groan like wood bending under pressure. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, sitting up. His breath fogged in the icy air. The fire in the wood stove had burned down to embers. "What?" Rachel asked groggily, stirring from her makeshift bed by the fireplace. "That sound." The others, scattered around the cabin on sleeping bags and blankets, began to stir. Marcus lit a lantern, his expression irritable. "What now, Danny?" "There's something outside," Danny said, his voice barely audible over the wind. Marcus rolled his eyes. "It's a blizzard. Of course there's something outside." "No," Danny insisted, standing and moving toward the frosted window. "It's not the storm. It's something else." Rachel joined him at the window, peering out into the swirling snow. "I don't see anything." As if on cue, the noise came again, a groan that seemed to vibrate through the cabin itself. It was closer this time. Rachel gasped and backed away from the window. "That's not the wind," she said, her voice shaking. The group fell silent, their eyes darting to each other. Then they heard it, heavy footsteps crunching through the snow, circling the cabin. Whatever it was big. Marcus grabbed the fireplace poker, his face pale. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice trembled. "A bear or something." "Bears hibernate in the winter," muttered Sam, the quietest of the group. She hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes wide. The footsteps stopped at the front door. The doorknob rattled. "No way," Claire whispered, backing toward the far wall. "No way. We locked it, right?" "Of course we locked it," Marcus snapped, gripping the poker tighter. The doorknob stopped moving, but the silence that followed was worse. It stretched on until Danny couldn't take it anymore. He edged toward the door, his heart hammering. "What are you doing?" Rachel hissed. "Just checking." He reached for the latch, his hand shaking, and cracked the door open just enough to peer outside. The wind roared into the cabin, carrying with it a flurry of snow. But beyond that, there was only darkness. "There's nothing there," Danny said, exhaling in relief. Then something lunged at the door. Danny screamed and stumbled back as the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Whatever was outside began to pound on the door, each blow shaking the frame. The sound was accompanied by a guttural growl, deep and wet like something from the bottom of a dark well. "Block the door," Marcus shouted. He and Danny shoved the sofa against it, their movements frantic. The pounding continued, relentless, and the wood began to splinter. "What is it?" Claire sobbed, her voice rising to a wail. "What the hell is it?" No one answered. They didn't know. The pounding stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. For a moment, no one moved. Then from somewhere above them, they heard a new sound, creaking floorboards. "The attic," Sam whispered. "It's in the attic." Marcus swore under his breath. "That's not possible. How would it get up there?" But the sounds above them continued, slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the ceiling. Rachel grabbed Danny's arm. "We need to leave. Now." "And go where?" Marcus snapped. "Into the storm? We'd freeze to death before we got a mile." Another sound joined the creaking, a low, rasping breath that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It surrounded them, filling the cabin like a living thing. "It's coming down," Sam said, her voice barely a whisper. The group backed away from the center of the room as the trapdoor to the attic began to tremble. Slowly, it creaked open, revealing a dark void. Something moved within the shadows, something too large to fit through the opening, yet it began to emerge. The lantern flickered and went out. In the darkness, the group heard the thing descend, not with the thud of feet, but with the wet, slithering sound of flesh dragging against wood. And then the screaming started.
Story number 3.
The snowstorm hit without warning, cutting off the small, rural town from the outside world. Thick snow blanketed the streets, swallowing cars and burying homes in a suffocating shroud of white. Ellie had grown up here, so she wasn't surprised by a harsh winter storm, but this one was different. There was a stillness beneath the howling wind, a charged silence that made her skin crawl. Ellie's parents were away visiting her grandmother in another state, leaving her alone in the creaking family farmhouse on the outskirts of town. She had planned to spend the weekend binge-watching old horror movies, But by the second day of the storm, the satellite signal was gone and the power was flickering. She lit every candle she could find and bundled herself in blankets, trying not to notice the way the shadows danced on the walls. As night fell, she heard it, a soft scratching at the window. At first, she thought it was the wind or a branch scraping the glass, but when she crept over to look, she saw something that made her blood freeze. A handprint. It was pressed into the frost on the outside of the window pane, long and spindly, with fingers too thin to belong to any person. Ellie staggered back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She forced herself to look again, but the handprint was gone, melted into the frost as if it had never been there. "You're imagining things," she whispered to herself, trying to ignore the growing pit of dread in her stomach. The sound came again, this time from the back door. A low, deliberate knock. Ellie grabbed the fireplace poker, her fingers trembling. She approached the door slowly, her heart pounding in her ears. "Who's there?" she called, her voice breaking. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. Ellie's grip on the poker tightened. She peered through the peephole, but all she could see was the swirling snow. Gathering her courage, she opened the door just a crack. There was nothing outside but darkness and the storm. Then she looked down. Tracks in the snow led from the edge of the woods to her porch. They weren't human. They were too large, too irregular, as if whatever had made them walked on misshapen, clawed feet. But what terrified Ellie most was that the tracks didn't lead away. They stopped right where she stood. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The poker felt useless in her hands. She backed away from the door, her eyes darting to the windows. She was completely alone, miles from her nearest neighbor. If something came for her, there would be no one to hear her scream. As the night wore on, the noises grew more insistent. The scratching at the windows moved from room to room as if something was circling the house. Once, she thought she heard a low chuckle, inhuman and guttural, carried on the wind. Then the power went out. The farmhouse plunged into darkness. Ellie scrambled for the candles, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the matches. She lit one and held it close, the tiny flame casting long, flickering shadows. The knock came again, this time from the front door. "Go away!" Ellie shouted, her voice cracking. "I have a weapon!" The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then she heard it, something moving in the walls. The sound was faint at first, a shuffling noise, as if something was dragging itself through the old wooden beams. It grew louder, more deliberate, and then it stopped directly behind her. Ellie spun around, the candle shaking in her hand. There was nothing there, just the faint outline of the living room furniture in the dim light. She turned back toward the door, her heart racing. Something was in the room with her. The candle went out. The darkness was absolute. Ellie froze, her ears straining for any sound. She could hear her own breathing, sharp and uneven, and the faint whistle of the wind through the cracks in the windows. Then from the darkness came a voice. Ellie. It was soft, almost tender, but it wasn't human. The sound was too layered, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. Ellie screamed and swung the poker wildly, the metal colliding with empty air. She backed into the corner of the room, clutching the poker like a lifeline. "Leave me alone," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. The voice came again, closer this time. "Ellie, come outside." "No." The shadows seemed to shift around her, growing thicker, darker. Ellie could feel something watching her, its presence pressing against her like a physical weight. She curled into a ball, sobbing, and covered her ears. When she finally opened her eyes, the storm had stopped. Pale light filtered through the windows, illuminating the wreckage of the room. Furniture was overturned, and deep gouges were carved into the wooden walls. The tracks outside the house were gone, as if they had never been there. Ellie never told anyone what happened that night. When her parents returned, she said nothing about the storm or the voice. But she knew it was still out there, waiting. And every winter, when the first snow began to fall, she locked every door and window and prayed the storm wouldn't come back.
Story number 4.
The snowstorm had swallowed the town whole, burying cars, closing roads, and cutting off power to every home. The only light came from the dull gray glow of the sky, which seemed to press down on the earth like a suffocating blanket. Annie had seen storms before, but nothing like this. It wasn't just the snow, it was the oppressive silence, the way the wind seemed to scream her name, the way the shadows outside didn't quite seem to match the landscape. She sat in her family's isolated cabin at the edge of the forest, a fire crackling weakly in the hearth. Her husband Peter had gone into town the day before to stock up on supplies, but he hadn't come back. She'd called his phone until the lines went dead, pacing the living room as worry gnawed at her insides. Now, with night falling, the silence of his absence felt unbearable. The first sign that something was wrong came just after dark. A knock at the door. Annie froze. It couldn't be Peter. He had a key, and no one else would be out here in the middle of the storm. She approached the door slowly, her breath clouding in the cold air. "Who's there?" she called, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. No answer. She glanced through the peephole but saw nothing except the swirling snow. Her heart pounded as she backed away from the door. That's when the knocking started again. Louder this time, more insistent. "Peter?" She tried again, her voice shaking. The knocking stopped abruptly. Annie stared at the door, her hand hovering over the deadbolt. Then she noticed something that made her stomach drop. Footprints leading to the porch. They were massive, the shape irregular, as if made by something with claws instead of toes. And they didn't lead back into the storm. Something was out there, and it was waiting. Annie backed away from the door, clutching the fire poker. The storm's howling seemed to grow louder, angrier, as if it had a will of its own. Then, from upstairs, she heard a faint creak. She whipped around, her heart hammering. Hello? No answer. The house was empty, or at least it was supposed to be. The creaking came again, this time louder. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the ceiling. Annie's mind raced. There was no way anyone could have gotten upstairs without her noticing. "Peter, if this is some kind of sick joke, it's not funny," she called, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like a physical presence pressing down on her chest. She gripped the fire poker tighter, her knuckles white. Then, with an ear-splitting crash, the trapdoor to the attic slammed open. Annie screamed, stumbling backward as a torrent of snow and debris spilled onto the floor. For a moment, nothing moved. Then she saw it, something in the attic, staring down at her through the gaping hole. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, too large and too bright to belong to anything human. She bolted for the front door, yanking it open despite the storm. The freezing wind hit her like a wall, but she didn't care. Anything was better than staying inside with whatever was in the attic. She ran blindly into the snow, her breath coming in gasps, her legs burning. Behind her, she heard it. The sound of something crashing through the house, following her. It moved fast, its heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. She didn't dare look back. Her foot caught on something buried in the snow, and she went sprawling, the fire poker flying from her grasp. She scrambled to her feet, but the thing was on her now. She could feel its presence, an overwhelming wave of cold and malice that froze her in place. Slowly, she turned her head. What she saw didn't make sense. It was too large, its body a mass of shifting shadows and sharp angles. Its face, or what she thought was its face, was a void, featureless except for those glowing eyes. It didn't move closer, but she felt it reaching for her all the same. "Peter," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Help me." The thing tilted its head as if mocking her. Then it raised one shadowy limb and pointed back toward the cabin. Annie didn't want to look, but something compelled her to. Through the swirling snow, she saw what the creature was pointing at. A figure standing in the open doorway of the cabin. It was Peter. But his face was wrong, his features slack and lifeless, his eyes empty. He stepped forward, his movements jerky, unnatural. The thing in the snow let out a low, guttural laugh, a sound that made Annie's blood run cold. Then the world went dark. When Annie woke, the storm was over. The sun shone weakly through the gray clouds, illuminating the pristine snow. There was no sign of footprints, no sign of the creature, no sign of Peter. The cabin was silent, its door swinging gently in the breeze. She never spoke of what happened that night. She left the cabin and never returned. But every winter, when the snow began to fall, she heard it again. The faint knocking carried on the wind and the sound of footsteps in the snow.
Story number 5.
The snowstorm came on fast, smothering the world in white. Erin had been halfway up the mountain trail when it started, hiking to the old ranger's cabin for some solitude. She wasn't worried at first. She'd done this hike a dozen times and knew the trail by heart. But as the snow fell heavier and the wind picked up, the path vanished, swallowed by the storm. She cursed herself for coming alone. The cabin was supposed to be a refuge, a place to clear her mind. Now, it felt like a distant, impossible goal. The cold cut through her clothes, and the snow stung her face. She trudged on, her breath clouding in front of her, until she saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. Her heart leapt. The cabin. But when she reached it, something felt off. The building was there, squat and sturdy as she remembered, but the light wasn't coming from inside. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the woods, faint and wavering, like a lantern carried by an unseen hand. Erin hesitated. The storm was bad, but not bad enough to make her forget the stories. The rangers used to joke about the Lantern Man, an old hermit who had supposedly died on the mountain decades ago. They said he still wandered the woods during storms, leading travelers astray. It's just a myth, she told herself, shaking her head. She pushed open the cabin door, her muscles aching with relief at the promise of shelter. Inside, the cabin was exactly as she remembered. A single room with a wood stove, a cot, and a stack of firewood by the door. She set about lighting a fire, her fingers numb as she struck the matches. As the flames caught, a flicker of movement at the window caught her eye. Erin froze. The light was back, closer now. It bobbed in the storm, just beyond the edge of the trees, too steady to be windblown. She tried to shake off the chill creeping up her spine. Maybe it was another hiker, someone who had lost their way. "Hello," she called, stepping to the door. The wind snatched her voice away, but the light didn't move. It hung there, motionless, almost expectant. Something about it felt wrong. Erin shut the door, bolted it, and backed away. She told herself to focus on the fire, to stop jumping at shadows. But as the night dragged on, the sense of unease grew. The light stayed. It didn't drift away as she had hoped. Instead, it circled the cabin, bobbing between the trees like a predator pacing its prey. At times, it would vanish, only to reappear at another window. Each time, it seemed closer. The stories came back to her then, clearer than ever. The Lantern Man didn't just wander aimlessly. He was said to lure people into the storm, guiding them to their deaths. Once they followed the light, they were never seen again. Erin laughed nervously to herself, trying to dismiss the idea. But when the door rattled, her breath caught in her throat. She stared at it, waiting for the sound to repeat, but the storm howled on, indifferent. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite. 3 taps, deliberate and measured. Erin's mouth went dry. She gripped the fire poker from beside the stove and approached the door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. Erin leaned close to the door, her ear inches from the wood. Through the wind's howl, she thought she heard something, a voice, faint and distant, calling her name. "Erin." She staggered back, her heart pounding. No one knew he was here. She hadn't told anyone where she was going. "Who are you?" she shouted. The voice came again, clearer this time, closer. "Erin, come outside." She shook her head, panic setting in. "Go away." The light appeared at the window again, impossibly bright, illuminating the entire room. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing behind it, a dark silhouette, tall and thin, with a head that tilted at an unnatural angle. The voice came from all around her now, filling the cabin. "Erin, it's safe. Follow me." The flames in the stove flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the window, where the figure now pressed closer. The glass began to frost over, spiderwebbing with cracks as if something was pressing against it from outside. Erin bolted for the back of the cabin, throwing open the trap door to the root cellar. She scrambled down, pulling the hatch shut behind her. In the suffocating darkness, she could still hear the voice, muffled but insistent. "Come outside, Erin. You're cold, aren't you? I can help." The trapdoor rattled, and the air grew colder, a bitter chill that seeped into her bones. She pressed herself into the corner, clutching the poker like a lifeline. The voice fell silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of her own breathing. Then she heard it, the soft creak of footsteps on the floor above her. It was inside. The light didn't lure her out into the storm. It didn't need to. It had found its way in.
Story number 6.
The snowstorm was the worst anyone in Hollow Creek had ever seen, trapping the entire town in their homes. Roads were impassable, power lines snapped under the weight of the ice, and temperatures plunged to record lows. Most families huddled together for warmth, trying to wait out the storm, but not Sarah. She was alone, house-sitting for her aunt in a secluded farmhouse on the edge of the woods. The farmhouse creaked in the wind, its old timbers groaning like a living thing. Sarah had been fine at first, cozying up with blankets and books, but as the hours dragged on, the isolation began to gnaw at her. The snow pressed against the windows, distorting the view of the outside world, and the wind howled like a living beast. She kept telling herself it was just the storm. Then came the noises. At first, they were faint, a distant tapping, like tree branches against the windows. She ignored it, figuring the storm was just playing tricks on her. But as night fell, the tapping grew louder, sharper, like knuckles rapping on glass. She tried to shake it off, turning the volume up on her phone to drown out the sound, but the battery was nearly dead. With the power out, she had no way to charge it, so she shut it off to save the last bit of juice for emergencies. The silence that followed was almost worse. The tapping came again. Sarah froze, her heart thudding in her chest. It wasn't coming from the window this time. It was coming from the front door. She grabbed the flashlight from the table and crept toward the sound. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Who's there?" No answer. The beam of her flashlight wavered as she reached the door. Snow was piled high against it and no footprints led to the porch. But still, the knocking continued, steady and deliberate. Sarah leaned closer, hesitating for only a moment before she peeked through the peephole. Nothing. Just the storm, a wall of swirling white. The knock came again, louder this time. It wasn't until she stepped back that she noticed the faint shape pressed against the frosted glass of the window beside the door. A face, or what she thought was a face, its features blurred and twisted, almost as if it were melting. Two dark voids where eyes should be stared directly at her. Sarah screamed and stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. When she scrambled to pick it up, the beam swept across the living room, landing on the back door. The knob was turning, slow and deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. She backed away, clutching the flashlight like a weapon, and darted into the kitchen. Her hands fumbled for the latch to the basement door. She needed somewhere to hide, somewhere out of sight. As she pulled the door shut behind her, plunging herself into darkness, she heard the back door creak open. Her hands trembled as she locked the basement door. She crouched on the steps, her flashlight turned off to avoid drawing attention. Above her, the sound of footsteps echoed through the house. They weren't hurried. Whatever had entered was taking its time, searching. Then it stopped. "Sarah," a voice called. It wasn't human. It was a low, distorted mockery of her name, stretching and twisting the syllables. It came from directly above her. "Come out, Sarah. It's safe now." Her blood ran cold. She hadn't told anyone she was house-sitting, and no one knew she was here. The voice moved closer until it was just outside the basement door. "You can't hide forever." The door handle rattled, then began to twist. Sarah clamped her hands over her mouth to stifle a sob, her mind racing. She had no way out, no windows, no exits. The rattling stopped. For a moment, there was silence, and Sarah dared to hope that whatever it was had given up. But then she heard the creak of the basement stairs. It was inside. Her flashlight flickered back to life as she scrambled deeper into the basement, her shaking hands fumbling for anything she could use to defend herself. The beam illuminated the far corner of the room where an old mirror leaned against the wall. In the reflection, she saw it. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its skin too pale, its face a hollow, featureless void. But it stood there, staring at her, its head tilting slowly to one side as if curious. Sarah whipped around, but there was nothing there. When she looked back at the mirror, the thing was smiling.
Story number 7.
The snowstorm raged like a living entity, battering against the windows of the remote lodge where Adam and his friends had decided to spend the weekend. The lodge, tucked deep into the forest, was supposed to be the perfect escape from their hectic city lives. Instead, it felt like a trap. The storm had cut off all power and phone reception by the first night. The group joked about roughing it and made the best of things, but by the second evening, the jovial atmosphere had soured. The cold seeped into every corner of the lodge, the shadows grew longer, and the howling wind carried strange, almost human wails. Adam was the first to notice something was wrong. As he stood by the window, staring out into the white abyss, he saw movement, something dark flickering between the trees. He squinted, pressing his face to the glass. It wasn't the wind moving the branches. Something was out there. "Hey, come check this out." Adam called to the others. Maya and Derek joined him at the window. "What are we looking at?" Derek asked, shivering. Adam pointed. "There. Do you see it? It's like someone's out there." Maya frowned. No way. Nobody could survive out there. But as they watched, the figure came into focus. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. The figure was tall, wrapped in a tattered cloak that billowed in the wind. Its face was hidden, but its movements were deliberate, purposeful. It stopped just at the edge of the tree line and turned toward the lodge. Derek laughed nervously. Probably just some lost hiker. Lost hikers don't stand still and stare like that, Adam said, his voice low. The figure raised one arm, pointing directly at the window. Maya gasped and stumbled back. Derek grabbed the curtain and yanked it shut. We're in the middle of nowhere, he said, his voice shaking. Nobody should be out there. Maybe we should, I don't know, call for help? With what? The phones are out, Maya snapped, her fear sharp in her tone. And even if they weren't, who would come in this storm? The group huddled in the living room, their earlier laughter replaced by tense silence. The figure didn't knock or try to come inside, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. They took turns peeking out through the curtains, but the figure was gone. That's when the knocking started. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the back door. Derek grabbed a fireplace poker and crept toward the door. "Stay behind me," he whispered to the others. Adam and Maya followed, their breaths visible in the icy air. Derek hesitated, his hand hovering over the lock. "Don't open it," Adam said, but Derek shook his head. "We can't just ignore it. What if someone needs help?" He opened the door a crack. The wind blasted inside, carrying a swirl of snow, but the porch was empty. No footprints, no sign of anyone. Derek closed the door and locked it, his knuckles white. "Maybe it was the wind," Maya offered, though her voice betrayed her doubt. The knocking came again, louder this time, and from the front door. Adam's stomach dropped. How did they get to the other side of the house so fast? The knocking turned into pounding, as if whoever or whatever was outside was trying to break down the door. Derek stepped forward, poker in hand, but this time, Adam grabbed his arm. "Don't. It's not someone who needs help." The pounding stopped. Silence fell over the lodge, so absolute it felt suffocating. Then came the sound of footsteps above them. Maya screamed, clapping a hand over her mouth. How did they get in?" Derek spun around, his eyes wide. "The attic." "Impossible," Adam said, though his voice wavered. "The attic doesn't have an entrance from outside." But the sound continued, heavy and deliberate. Footsteps crossed the ceiling, slow and purposeful, as if whoever was up there wanted them to know they weren't alone. Adam grabbed a flashlight and led the group to the attic hatch in the hallway. They stared up at the dark opening. The footsteps stopped. "Don't," Maya begged. "Please, let's just stay together." But Adam couldn't ignore it. He climbed the ladder, flashlight in one hand, a knife from the kitchen in the other. He poked his head into the attic, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. The attic was empty. Adam's breath came in ragged gasps. There was no one there. But as he turned to climb back down, he saw something written on the inside of the attic hatch, carved into the wood with jagged strokes. "Let me in." The flashlight flickered and died. Adam dropped the knife and scrambled down the ladder, his heart pounding. "We need to leave," he said, grabbing Maya and Derek by the arms. "Into the storm?" Maya cried, but Adam didn't care. He threw open the front door, dragging them into the freezing night. They stumbled through the snow, blinded by the wind, until the lodge was just a dark shape behind them. That's when they heard it, the laughter, low and guttural, coming from all around them as if the storm itself were alive. Adam turned back toward the lodge, and in the window he saw them. Figures. Too many to count, their glowing eyes fixed on him, their mouths stretched into inhuman smiles. The last thing he heard before the storm swallowed them was a voice, cold and hollow, whispering in his ear, "You shouldn't have left."
Story number 8.
The blizzard struck faster than anyone in Stillwater expected, blanketing the town in an eerie, otherworldly quiet. Karen was alone in her small, rented house at the edge of the frozen lake. She had planned for a peaceful weekend to catch up on work, but the storm had made sure of one thing. She wasn't going anywhere. By evening, the power had gone out, leaving her with nothing but a few candles and the faint orange glow of her fireplace. She'd made herself a cup of tea and wrapped herself in a blanket when she heard it. A soft, distant sound, almost like humming. Karen froze, tilting her head to listen. The sound was faint but unmistakable, cutting through the storm outside. It seemed to be coming from the lake. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it. Maybe it was the wind or ice shifting under the weight of the snow. She forced herself to focus on her book. But then she heard it again, louder this time. A woman's voice, singing. Karen moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The storm was fierce, the snow whipping across the frozen lake in thick, blinding sheets. She could barely see anything beyond her porch, let alone the shoreline. But the singing persisted, haunting and melodic, carrying a tune that sent a shiver down her spine. She grabbed her coat and boots, her curiosity getting the better of her. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself, but the sound was so strange, so out of place, that she had to investigate. She stepped outside into the biting cold, the wind stealing her breath. The singing grew clearer as she approached the lake. It was a lullaby, soft and mournful, sung in a language Karen didn't recognize. She squinted into the storm, trying to find the source, but the frozen expanse was empty. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely carrying over the wind. The singing stopped. Karen's heart pounded in her chest as silence descended, thick and heavy. She turned to head back to the house, but then she saw it, a figure standing on the ice. At first, she thought it might be another person, someone stranded in the storm. But as she stepped closer, she realized how wrong she was. The figure was impossibly tall and thin, its limbs elongated and angular. Its head was too large for its body, tilted unnaturally to one side. It didn't move, didn't react to her presence. It simply stood there, its shadow stretching across the ice like it was cast by a fire. Karen stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The figure raised an arm, pointing toward her with a bony hand. Then the ice cracked. The sound was deafening, echoing across the frozen lake. Karen turned and ran, her boots slipping on the slick surface. She could hear the ice splitting behind her, the cracks spiderwebbing toward her, like living things. The singing started again, louder now, more insistent. It wasn't beautiful anymore. It was a command. Run. She reached the shore and scrambled up the bank, her legs burning with effort. When she dared to look back, the figure was gone. But the ice at the center of the lake was shattered, a dark hole yawning where the figure had stood. Karen didn't sleep that night. She sat by the fire, clutching a kitchen knife, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. The singing didn't return, but the storm didn't let up either, trapping her in a cocoon of isolation. The next morning, she ventured back to the lake, unable to resist the pull of curiosity. The storm had passed, leaving a crystalline world of snow and ice. The hole in the lake's surface had refrozen, but something dark was visible just beneath the ice. Karen knelt down, brushing away the snow with gloved hands. Her breath fogged the surface as she leaned closer. At first, she thought it was just a shadow, but then she saw it. A face, frozen in the ice, its eyes wide and staring, its mouth open in a silent scream. She stumbled back, her heart racing. As she stared, the face moved. Its eyes rolled to meet hers, and its mouth began to twist, forming words she couldn't hear but understood all the same. "You heard me." The ice cracked again, and the singing returned.
Story number 9.
The storm was so fierce that it seemed to erase the world outside. Heavy snow piled against the cabin's windows, and the wind howled like a chorus of tormented souls. Connor had rented the isolated cabin to get some peace and quiet while finishing his novel, but he was starting to regret it. The storm was worse than predicted, and with no phone signal and the power out, he felt like the last person alive on Earth. He had been writing by candlelight when the scratching started. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm, and he thought it might be a tree branch brushing against the roof. But when it moved, soft scrapes traveling from one side of the cabin to the other, he realized it was something else, something alive. Connor froze, his fingers tightening on his pen. The sound grew louder, circling the cabin as if something were dragging sharp claws across the wooden walls. He grabbed the flashlight from the table and went to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. Nothing. The storm made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, but he had the unsettling sense that something was just beyond the edge of his vision, watching him. The scratching stopped. Connor let out a shaky breath and stepped away from the window. Just the wind, he told himself, though the words felt hollow. He sat back at the table and tried to focus on his writing, but the quiet was oppressive. Then came the knock. It wasn't a polite knock. It was slow, deliberate, and heavy, like someone was testing the strength of the door. Connor's stomach twisted. No one else was supposed to be out here. The cabin was miles from the nearest road, and the storm made it impossible for anyone to travel. He didn't move. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural voice. "Let me in." Connor's heart raced. The voice was deep and rasping, like something that had forgotten how to speak. He backed away from the door, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The storm swallowed his words, but the voice came again, closer now. "It's cold. Let me in." Connor's blood ran cold. The voice didn't come from the door this time. It came from the window. He spun around, aiming the flashlight beam at the glass, but saw only his own terrified reflection staring back. The scratching resumed, louder than before, and now it was on the roof. Heavy footsteps thudded overhead, and he could hear the wood creak under the weight. Whatever it was huge. "Go away," Connor shouted, though his voice was barely audible over the storm and the pounding of his own heartbeat. The cabin fell silent again. Connor stood frozen in the center of the room, his breath clouding in the freezing air. The storm seemed to quiet for a moment, the wind dying down to a faint whisper. Then the laughter started. It wasn't human. It was a guttural, choking sound, rising and falling like a twisted melody. It came from all around him, above, below, outside, inside. Connor felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He backed into the corner of the room, clutching the flashlight. The laughter stopped abruptly, and then the voice came again, this time in a whisper, inches from his ear. "You're already too late." The candles sputtered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The flashlight flickered, casting jittery shadows across the walls. Connor spun around, aiming the beam at the door, the windows, the ceiling, but he saw nothing. Then he saw the marks, deep gouges in the wood, long and jagged, crisscrossing the walls like something had been trying to claw its way in, or out. They hadn't been there before. Connor stumbled back, his foot catching on the edge of the table, and he fell hard to the floor. As he scrambled to his feet, he noticed something on the table. His notebook. It was open to a blank page, but written across it in jagged, uneven letters were 3 words: "Look behind you." Connor didn't want to turn. His breath came in shallow gasps, his hands trembling as the flashlight flickered again. Slowly he turned his head. The last thing he saw was a face, pale, hollow-eyed, and grinning far too wide before the flashlight went out completely, and the storm swallowed his screams.